An author in Santa Barbara, California believes that rent control will lead to lower property values, deteriorating properties, and bankrupt landlords. I'm Tony, and this is Real Estate Investing and Landlord News. All right, so I have an interesting article for you today, and it's coming out of Santa Barbara, California. Now, in a previous video, I actually mentioned the fact that the city of Santa Barbara is looking at a rent control ordinance within the city, and I was just trying to convey how much I dislike that idea, okay? I think rent control is awful, and sometimes I don't make it as clear as possible when I'm trying to explain the reasons why rent control is bad. But the article here, it actually goes over the points that I believe 100% in, and I agree with everything this author is trying to say. Now, before I get into the article though, go ahead, hit the like and subscribe button if you haven't already, and let me know what you think of rent control. Do you think this thing is going to spread throughout the country? I felt like with all of the stuff that's happening lately, with the eviction moratoriums and, all the good cause eviction and all these tenant-friendly laws are spreading. And, Minnesota is not that far from where I live, yet they just passed a rent control ordinance up in St. Paul and in Minneapolis. And it just blows my mind that, hey, we're not immune to this nonsense here in the Midwest, okay? So, this article comes from newspress.com, and it says, "Here's why rent control won't work." And like I said, this author makes very, very good points. Now let's get into it. In response to Santa Barbara's rent control ordinance, here are my top 6 reasons why rent control is bad for renters. Number 1, it increased rents. Landlords are incentivized to raise rent by the maximum amount by law every chance they get, because if they do not, they will lose the chance later. This results in more frequent rent increases for renters. Now, I agree with this, okay? I have some of my properties which I don't raise rent on every single year. But imagine you're put into a situation where, hey, if you do not increase your rent by the maximum amount possible, you won't get that opportunity back in the future. So, for example, in St. Paul, Minnesota, they said the maximum rent increase per year is 3%. So let's say you're charging $1,000 a month. That means you can only raise that rent by $30 a month. So now the next year, your rent would be $1,030. But if you don't raise the rent that year and you try to give your tenants a break, well, the year after that, you can't raise it, you can't make up for that lost 3%. No, you're just screwed over. That money is gone and you can never get it back. So you're just stuck behind at that point. So as your costs increase, as maintenance increases, as everything increases, you have to keep as close to possible. And in the case of St. Paul, at least, if you're limited to a 3% increase, you have to raise your rent 3% every year. Number 2, poorer living conditions. Landlords do not have the incentive to maintain and improve rent-controlled property as much as market rate rentals because they do not have the ability to increase the rent as needed. This results in less maintenance, cutbacks in upgrades, and poorer service to tenants. And this is very true, okay? Now, I've gone over articles where basically up in New York City, right? And this is, one of the places where rent control is a big issue. They will have tenants living in these apartments and they haven't been updated in 30, 40 years. So you'll go in the place, right? It'll be livable, but hey, it doesn't have the newest modern furnace in there. It doesn't have a new thermostat in there. It doesn't have the most, nice paint on the walls. But the reason is because, simply put, the landlord has zero incentive to actually do upgrades on any of the units. You won't leave the unit, okay, because you don't want to lose that rent. So they have cases of they've had tenants in some of these units for 20, 30, 40 years, and they are living in basically the 1970s and 80s because that's the last time that the units were upgraded. Now everything in there works, but hey, it looks like an old dumpster, I mean, it looks like crap. Okay. And some of the stuff is just barely working. So, just think about all the old technology that we have slowly replaced as time has gone by. And imagine being in a unit where, hey, the landlord never replaced any of this because they had no incentive to do so. 3. Tenants will sublease. If a tenant's rent-controlled apartment is below market rates, tenants may sublease their unit to pocket the difference as profit to themselves. This scheme was used repeatedly in rent control in Santa Monica. Therefore, in many instances, rent control does not provide lower rents, but incentivizes tenants to sublease illegally to pocket the difference in the market rate. Yeah, and I heard about this happening not only in New York, but I believe in I can't remember. There was some European city where I heard the same thing was going on. So, basically, if you're able to get a unit, right, and the market rate for a unit is $500, I'm not 500, but let's say it's $1,000 a month, right? But you're able to get into the unit for $500 a month. What a lot of these tenants are doing is saying, I'm not even going to live in there, right? I'm going to rent it out for the $1,000 a month and then pocket the extra $500. I mean, it's really kind of like a way of them being a landlord. However, their thought was originally that, rent control is going to help with affordable housing, and when it's not. It's instead of allowing the landlord to make the profit, now you have a tenant who is making this profit instead, and that's completely ridiculous. Okay, and on top of that, there's the units are still old and dilapidated. They're still not in good shape. So you're telling the landlord they don't get enough money to keep their properties up and then make a decent profit, but you're allowing the tenant to do the same thing, and not allow. It doesn't make any sense. That's all I can say. Number 4, the best landlords are mom and pop owners, not corporations, governments, or affordable housing agencies. Why? Mom and pops may have lived in the property years ago, have pride in the property, usually like the tenants, and often do not increase rents. I often hear from landlords saying they have not raised the rent on their renter since they moved in 10 or more years ago because they want to help them. They are such nice tenants and like family to them. With rent control, landlords are encouraged to raise rents to the maximum allowed by law or risk the chance of raising it later if needed. And yeah, the best landlords are mom and pop landlords, in my opinion. Of course, I am a mom and pop landlord, or a pop landlord, I guess you could say. And my personal opinion has been, hey, we are the ones who are providing a lot of the affordable housing that the communities need, because we are renting properties to people who wouldn't necessarily qualify to live in this big corporate apartment complex because they don't meet the credit score or they don't meet all of their criteria. I'm not saying that we don't have our own criteria, but we are more capable of slightly adjusting that criteria so that we can bring good tenants in. And we also charge lower rents. We're less likely to raise rent, and we are willing to work with the tenants more often. Now, a lot of the times what that means is, especially during the eviction moratorium, we got screwed over a lot. Okay, but that doesn't change the fact that when you put these rent control measures into place, you're hurting us, and that isn't a good thing. Number 5, banks do not like to lend on properties with rent control because of the increased risk of default. Expenses and inflation may rise more than an increase in rent, making their loan payments more at risk. This hurts renters with fewer properties available, higher interest rates because of riskier loans, and less money available for the landlord to invest in the property for the renter. And that's very true, okay? A lot of people, they don't consider the fact that, hey, multifamily properties are valued based upon the rent that they can bring in. Okay, so if we are unable to increase our rents, then we cannot increase the value of the property, and sometimes it might devalue our property in being in a place where rent control is in place. So banks don't want to lend to us, and we if we can't get a loan from a bank, we can't maintain these properties. Okay, so what I am trying to say here is that Simply put, all of these different aspects are very, very important to why I hate rent control. But there's one more thing here. Number 6, property values and condition deteriorate. Rental property values are based on their income. Lower income equals lower value. Lower values equals poorer condition. Fact, renters do not care for properties as much as owners. Thus, renters will be forced to live in poorer conditions. The incentive should be for home ownership, not perpetual renting. One's wealth is not created by renting. Owning your home with no debt is the most affordable housing you will ever have. Let's use that as your goal when making affordable housing decisions. Rent control is not the answer to cheaper living costs. Home ownership, more supply, lower property taxes, ease of regulations, and more free market competition in housing are the answers. And that's from Alan S. Jones, president and principal broker of the Santa Ynez Valley Real Estate Company. And I completely agree with him, okay? So all of these things are so important, okay? And, I want to go over that again. Home ownership, more supply, lower property taxes, ease of regulations, and more free market competition. Not socialist housing policies like rent control, not public housing owned by the government. These things are not what's going to make housing affordable in the long run.